Today we have the pleasure of talking to Nanno Kleiterp, if I have said that right. Nanno is the really it's a bundle of knowledge, a person so easy to talk to, although he held the most highest position in development as the CEO of FMO, one of the most innovative and focused on really entrepreneurship, and Nanno has led that organization. He was also the chairman for the European Development Finance Institution. So not only he brings the ideas of development from a very senior perspective as the ex-CEO of FMO, but he has also the experience of multiple development agencies, well steeped in it. Nanno also has written a book, if you can see that, it's called Banking for a Better World. And that, sort of defines really in some ways his experiences and how he feels that development banks can play a role with the private sector and really open up the field. So it's a short book. So if you get a chance, please do read it. So Nanno, thank you very much for joining us today. Maybe we can start by talking a little bit about how you got started in your career early on as a young man, what influences you had that eventually led you to the FMO platform, and maybe you can introduce us to your, to your earlier days as you were growing up, and what influenced you to look at the developing world and to be a part, to be an important part of it. So maybe we can start there, Nanno.
Yes, thank you, Asad. Going back in time, I think it was in my studies. I started studying economics. And in those times, after the first 3 years, you had to decide to specialize, or in macroeconomics or corporate economics, or as I choose, a new direction, which was called sociological economics. And I think looking back, that was, I didn't see it at this time, but that was quite a crucial decision, because let's say my conviction was that economic models are useful and are there, but were not really of my interest. I really saw the economy is driven by people, and people should be the core of the thinking of economy, and are determining what the economy looks like. So that was that idea I choose for sociological economics. This is a combination of the sociological phenomena and what happens in economy, what happens in crisis, what's the behavior of people, and so then my thinking started. Important part of economy is, of course, that it assumes that every individual person seeks to maximize his profits, his benefits, and that any company only can exist if it seeks to maximize its profits. And at that time, I had my doubts if that was a good assumption. But, well, it could be discussed, but of course it could not be changed. And so the funny thing, or not so, let's say, maybe a logical thing, but I didn't see it at that time as such, is that I ended up working for a company like FMO, the Dutch Development Bank, which sets development impact at number one, and return as a condition for its continuity, and not as something to maximize. The development impact has to be maximized. But that only looking back, you see that's kind of threats in your life. And then I went to work in Peru in a development project with small farmers. Was the question, what do small farmers need to adapt technologies that can improve their welfare? And that was, of course, very useful in a government. Let's say that was a government to government project from the Dutch government towards the Peruvian government. And there I learned how difficult it is uh, from a development or from a developed country which has its own ideas how development should look like, and the recipient, the Peruvian government, which has their ideas. So the Dutch government wanted to promote small farmers, while the Peruvian government saw that medium-sized farmers would improve productivity and the production of food much more and much faster. So they accepted the whole project for the small farmers, but they tried to do anything to make it a different project. So how difficult it is to work, to understand each other, and when you offer money for free, then there are no real targets of the success, and it's let's say it's not as disciplined. I think if you offer money, which has to create a return. No? So you saw that finally, because of the differences in view on what the project should bring, the project failed, I think, in the long run. So I learned there, how difficult it is to work with governments, and how complicated it is if your only instrument is grants. No? And then I had a similar experience in Mexico, more in credit-oriented credit projects with small farmers in Mexico. And then I went to work in Nicaragua after the Sandinista revolution, and there I worked in the development bank. And there I saw how much more effective it can be when you have a business plan, when you have targets on the return, when you have to give the money back. And there's much more alignment of interest in the let's say the entity that invests and the entity that receives and has to pay because the money back, because then you're serious. No, it has to be success, because if not, you cannot pay the money back. So I think those are the things that led me, when I came back to the Netherlands, to join FMO, that I saw the model of private sector development as very important, and also the model of not giving grants but investing, that could be much more effective than the grants. And of course there are different, let's say, grants can also be very very effective and useful, but that's, for me, that relationship, it brings a much more equal relationship towards the people you work with, than if they depend on your money, on your grants, and then that's it, or if you really work together and make a success of a project that creates development and that creates also return.
Which year was this in Nanno? So you graduated in social economics, which is interesting when in its own right. But then you, instead of working in Netherlands, you chose to go to Peru and to really experience on the ground. And I think at that time, I'm not sure, I know you're a fluent Spanish speaker now, but at that time, were you able to communicate in Spanish, or was that?
I could order a beer. Yes, absolutely. That was more or less my level. Una cerveza, por favor. No, but you learn it fast. And then I found my girlfriend, a beautiful Peruvian girl, which this year we are married 40 years. So and that congratulations. Thanks. And that helps very much in learning a language. That went rather fast. Yes.
So your early experience in this idea was really fortunate, because it showed you very early on in your career that it's not just working with governments that will achieve results, but working with businesses and using business methods to achieve social goals, and that you brought that to the FMO. And in which year did you join FMO? Was it in the 80s or the 70s? When were you?
That was in the 80s, 1987. I joined.
87. Okay. And okay. And then so you rose through the FMO and really, became the senior investment officer and then the CEO. And you stayed there for 2 terms, right? You were there for a significant time as the CEO.
Yeah. So I joined the management board. Which year was that? In 1995. as CFO. That was not my first ambition, but there was a CEO that left, and they said, "Well, could you do this job interim?" And I said, "Well, okay, yeah, that's a nice experience." And then after half a year, they said, "Well, could you stay? Don't you want to stay?" So then I learned a lot about risk management and all the financial market stuff. And then I became CIO, not Chief Investment Officer. That was really what I liked most in FMO. And then after I think 8 years, then I became the CEO. I was for 8 years CEOs, and I was about 20 years in the management board of FMO in different roles.
So you really are, you grew from the grassroots level, from working with small farmers to working with development agency, and then sort of coming to a larger development agency and working your role through, all the fundamentals of risk management and things, and becoming a chief investment officer and the CEO. What would you say that you're most proud of in that illustrious 20 years you've spent at a FMO? How have you seen development fundamentally change in that period of time?
Well, I think the fundamental change was when I joined FMO. First of all, it was a very small company. There were 50 people. I think we had a balance sheet of 300 guilders by that time, so 150 million. When I left, it was 10 billion, a balance sheet of 10 billion. But the most important change, I think, was, of course, the government is 51% shareholder of FMO, and the Dutch banks 49%. But I think what in the beginning was very obvious to me was that the government was not very interested in FMO. No, it was there, and if anybody asked the minister, "Do you something with the private sector?" Say, "Yeah, I have FMO," and for the rest, he could do what he wanted to do. So there was a huge belief in that the public sector was the one that should make change, and that should make change in the countries. That should look for more, let's say, less poverty. And that has been quite a long time. And the private sector was there just to make money. And you should be very suspicious of it, because that was only, they're interested in only thing in money and not in people, and not in creating social change. And I think that has slowly changed over the years. But I think that took, let's say, 87. So that was mid-90s when they became more interested in, hey, wow, what are these development banks doing? And then what's FMO doing? Oh, that looks, that also can have an impact. And even they are making a profit. And and they create jobs. They change markets. That awareness grew. Let's say, in the late 90s, the beginning of the century, that really became, I think, an important stream in development, in thinking about development and making progress.
Great. So one of the things that you feel was the most significant is the shift from sort of governmental help to private sector help, and looking at private companies in a more holistic way than just seeing them as not responsible and just interested in profit. And that is quite a remarkable change in terms of perception in a relatively short period of time. Do you feel that while we are early in the journey in terms of private sector coming in a big way in development, do you feel that the challenges for the private sector are perceptual in terms of risk? Are they real risk? And how do we sort of, what do we do further to bring the development and to, what you consider to be one of the greatest change in development field, in sort of collaborating with the private sector? How do you further that element of it, Nanno? I mean, you've come a long way. We've come here, still a long way to go.
Absolutely.
What do you think could be done to engage more of the private sector? Because they still talk a lot about these things, but actual investments, even from companies, like Goldman Sachs or others that are, sort of touting their impact investing credentials, if you ask them how much money have you spent yourself of your balance sheet, there are not many companies who can say they've taken some balance sheet risk. How do you see that, that evolution? And I guess, how do you see, what can we do as the, sort of to further that and to push on the idea of that the corporates have a role in the development of the world?
Yes. So I think what the development banks, the DFIs and the multilateral development banks has brought to the private sector is the awareness in ESG. No, so in looking at the environment, that was the first step. Then it was also social, the social impact and the awareness on social impact and not doing any harm. Then the importance of governance in private sector and public sector, but both very important. I know in FMO that was also always a big struggle. No, a lot of companies said, yeah, all your conditions, and you don't understand the situation here in our country. It's completely different. And then when we, of course, we insisted that it was a condition. Then in a lot of cases, after a few years, they came back and thanked us for putting these conditions in place because they saw the value of it. They just became a better company in all aspects, not only in these aspects of environmental, social, but in all impacts, how they deal, and also a better, in a lot of cases, a better valued company. Of course, at the same time, you see big corporates moving more in that direction. No, I think Unilever, and then it's for how long is the question, but with Paul Polman was, of course, said what is a sustainable living plan really put an impact in the core of also Unilever's business. But you see also the problem is that it's very tied to one person. No, and in a lot of cases, it's a leader that makes a difference. And the moment the leader leaves, it fades. The risk is that it fades away. And in some cases it is, but always something stays. I think there are more and more companies with that awareness. So I think that is key in the first place. And then the second, what you're mentioning is the capital, where the capital is, of course, is with the big pension funds, the insurance companies, and that's where the big capital is, what should be directed more to the SDGs. There's a very slow, step-by-step signs that is happening, but of course, if you look at, let's say that the economy between emerging markets and developed markets is about, I think, around 50-50. Well, then the 5% of the investments of the big, the big pension funds worldwide are dedicated to emerging markets, and the rest to developed markets. That is still the case, but also there's a lot of pressure. You see it moving. So development banks can play the role to, let's say, create what is called these blended structures, no, with soft capital and more hard capital, so that you crowd in reality, the more commercial investors, make them see let them experience, let them see the risk, that the risk are much lower than what they say. But it's also a lot about lack of experience and thinking, wow, that's everything is risky when you're talking about emerging markets. Well, the proof is that there are a lot of good businesses we don't. No, microfinance, I think, it was created as an asset class, and of course, also things have gone wrong. But nothing is perfect, and nothing always goes well. But overall, you see that with microfinance has been able to reach out to poor people, has been seen as that at the same time you can make a return, that it are sustainable business models. So those business models didn't exist before 20 years ago, no? And now they are there. Now also commercial investors are investing in it. And as always, you have to be very careful to maintain the mission. Sometimes it deviates, and then it's again all about money and not looking considerably at the people and how to make their lives better. but I think that's part of life, that that those things happen. At the same time, we see more and more businesses that are coming at scale and can absorb the money of the pension funds. But we are still at the beginning of the investing in these kind, let's say, more in the SDGs, more in the emerging markets, more in the green economy. We're just starting.
Right. Now, I think you really said a lot in terms of where we are and how do we sort of really go to. And one of the things that I can relate to is an individual makes the hell of a difference in an organization. And how do you sustain the leaders' quality within the company, right? Usually when I went for investments from Storebrand, large Norwegian conglomerate, and Frederick Ottosen, who was at CFO at that time, within 15 minutes of that meeting, he said, this is something that we would want to do. Let's find a way to do it. Because he became the internal champion to really show the path. I think it's partly, we still have a lot of work, Nanno, in the sense that, you talk about, bringing the private sector in, but having them see that at scale and, be engaged in the experience. It's a catch-22, without money, you can't have change. Without change, you can't have money. So the markets won't grow for the appetite of the larger investors. But somewhere within the field of, CSR, because I worked for CSR for Deutsche Bank, and although it was, I wouldn't say that Deutsche Bank was the most progressive in supporting, but it really gave the money to do interesting things that I couldn't have done. So I don't see, money being labeled as one thing or the other. Money is money. Ultimately, in order for us to grow this idea, we need all sorts of interest, and frankly, Nanno, Deutsche Bank's interest in this, given its scale and largeness, couldn't be purely business, right? It was more strategic. And I think for me, that's fine, Nanno. Do you, being pragmatic and sort of building on what's available and, creating this blended finance ideas while they are there, right? The challenge, Nanno, and I don't, I'm not sort of telling you to find the answer, but really, since I have this opportunity to talk to somebody who has a really from a grassroots level, from his early career to the senior most level, and to see a broad spectrum of development banks, how do we sort of break that challenge of finding risk capital and bringing blended finance and bringing this perpetual challenge that I have had for, my career of 25 years in this sector of running it's difficult for the early risk. How do we crack that nut? I think, so there are developments now, a lot of development banks like, BII has something called Kinetics, which does first loss. FMO has Massive that does, but how do we instigate that and the pace of development in terms of the resources of the development agencies? How do you see that challenge and the ability of governments to give more resources for this work, even if it is a profitable effort? I'm asking a lot of things here, Nanno, but I think you understand what I'm trying to get at. The crux of the matter, still early for corporates. How do you get them interested? Is the corporate social responsibility a window for interaction, at least for a period of time? And then how do you raise the early risk money that can really lever some of these funds and that can take the perceptual risk out of it? So a lot to throw at you, but I'd love to hear your opinions on this issue.
Yeah, no, thanks, Simon. Those are a lot of different questions. So I see two tracks in reality. And one is building also new businesses from scratch. I think there's one very important saying that I always used is it has to be scalable, and if it's not scalable, it's a hobby, no? And that is what I see. There are too many small projects that are kind of pet projects of our politicians or people from the private sector, whatever, which are okay. Let's say there's nothing wrong with it. They help people, but normally they are, in a lot of cases, they're not sustainable. So when the person that creates the project and goes away, there's nothing left. There's nothing much left. In a lot of cases, of course, for sure there will be also success stories, but the view from the beginning has to be it has to scale. No, if you don't get to scale, there's no impact, and there's no real impact, and there's no lasting impact. So building these new business models, I think that is very key, and I think development banks should play an even more important role in it than now. So that needs innovation, that needs the willingness to take risks. That needs belief in people, because it's a lot of cases, it's an entrepreneur, it's people that are doing it. So you were asking me what I'm proud of in FMO, that we built also not only FMO, but new businesses were created. And sometimes directly by FMO, sometimes because people left FMO and started new things. So one of the things I think FMO should be proud of is creating TCX, the currency exchange, which makes it possible to do local currency financing. That has grown to a certain size, but really needs a big scale, much bigger, because local currency financing is key to development. And without local currency and burdening clients, countries, there is the currency risk has a very negative effect. But that company was created on the initiative of FMO. And people from FMO were leading that and created it, and it grew big. No, big size, but it should grow much bigger. Another company that during my time was created was Climate Investor One. That was the kind of blended structure, but also to combine development phase with the implementation phase, with the final up and running, let's say, phase of, especially in energy, because there was not, especially in difficult countries and in Africa, there are not sufficient projects. So you need also, as a development bank, to help and support development of these projects, and which is the highest risk phase. So I'm proud that that's a company now. It started, I think it has now also already 2 billion under management. So doing quite well, and setting a new model which wasn't there. So I think that's very much what development banks can be there in the first phase.
Instigator of change is what you're saying.
Yes, absolutely. Really. Yeah. Instigator of change, that needs courage, that needs innovation, and that needs a willingness to take risk. And I think there are different development banks that are doing that already, but it should be scaled up. It should be much more, no?
Yeah.
Then you have the other track, and that's getting to scale. No? From there, getting to scale. So also there, I'm involved in a very interested initiative. It's called ILX, and that is, let's say, investing in the B loans of the development banks and of the multilateral development banks also. And for the first time, we were able to enter the big capital, no, of APG, biggest pension fund, one of the biggest pension funds in the world, and it was a completely new product for them, no, emerging market private debt. So they had to create a new asset class within the pension fund, but that's really a breakthrough. And we start with $1 billion. So then you're really talking about scale. I'm sure that being successful, this will scale up. So then you have the whole basis of the development banks. You use their assets, you take their assets. Also, no, we can also buy loans and assets from the development banks, and you get to commercial, the pension funds investing in it. Once they see that at scale, and this was the model, because problem of the big pension fund is projects or investments under 500 million are not interested to them. No, so that was the problem. They wanted to do something, but there was nothing at scale. So creating the scale gives you access to the bigger pension funds. And once these bigger pension funds get that's my hope and my expectation, gets the experience, they see that it works, they see that the risks are not so terrible and not so as they think that everything in Africa you shouldn't touch, or even in Asia and in Latin America. So you need also that track that a successful initiative really can get to scale. And also there you need innovation. And the fantastic thing of ILX, it's not a blended structure. So you're not giving subsidies to the investor, just the diversification and the experience, the long-term track record of development banks, and having an intermediate that can explain that in the words of the pension funds, in the logic of the pension funds. That was the key to success.
So this syndication of development bank credit, right? Was it credit enhanced in any way, or was it just passed through?
No, and I think that was the person who started this. He was very convinced that not credit enhancement, because then it's something special. You cannot only do it with soft money. They have to accept the risk as it is. And it took him 5 years to convince the biggest Dutch pension funds. But then it's much stronger than if you do the blended finance structure. Of course, blended finance is also very useful. Now, in high risk countries, in specific assets where you take away the first risk in a first, but also it should be temporary. Building scale sometimes requires guarantees or first loss in order to get to scale. And then I'm in a fund that's called Ant Green. It's focused on investing in big agriculture companies, in palm oil, meat, soy. So that's the beginning of the phase. So we see until $1 billion, we really need risk mitigation. We need blended finance. When this vehicle grows above $1 billion, then the costs are low. You have a track record, and then you can continue. You don't need the support anymore. I think that's the way that blended finance should be structured. Now, if you always have to take away the risk, then it's a limited effect and a limited leverage that you reach.
Right. They have to write a memo saying that there's some risk. If the Dutch government fully guarantees it, then they're not investing in emerging markets, they're investing in the Dutch government. I think so like the I know IFC has issues paper in the market, but that's on a AAA rated structure, is it a multi-narrative? What you're talking about is really that the pension funds like APG and a couple of others in Holland had actually taken risk on a portfolio of your loans that you've done, and direct risk. That is, I think that is quite different, and I think it's a great progress. Right? How do we sort of increase that, Nanno? Instead of such an important effort that you have done, how do we convince the greater, should we showcase this transaction? Should we have alternatives? Should we bring other development banks? Because, I've tried this idea before, Nanno. A lot of the tension with development banks was that they didn't want to reduce their balance sheet size. It was a natural, these assets are not easy to acquire. There was if you let go $1 billion from your balance sheet, that's quite a lot of capital, but it's the right thing to do, because then you have to create new assets where you specialize. So in your mind, Nanno, what would you think that we can do to take such interesting things that FMO has done of, creating TCX and creating, different, so many asset managers like myself that I owe my first investment to FMO. How do we do it? How do we, should we work with you to sort of bring the private sector, showcase the deal, show them the deal? What is there the natural communication to be happened on the success of this important pivot that you have done as a development bank? Or do you think that is not getting the attention it deserves, or the challenges are more than what I am imagining?
Yeah, and the challenges are big. No, let's say the problem is that's all going too slow. Yeah, no, I don't have all the answers to your difficult questions. I think I agree with you that still the development banks, the bilateral and the multilateral development banks, are holding tight to their assets, and I think they could use their capital much more efficient. No, it's as to this kind of vehicles, sell the assets that are ready and that are proven and that have a track record to the private sector, and take again risk and create these new businesses or stimulate the new businesses, and so it should much more than it is today be a machine that creates assets, that takes risks, that is innovative, shows them that they can be brought to the market, and then the market can buy. No, so those, let's say, what I mentioned was which I think was created recently. That it was not created by development bank, but by the initiative of of great people that were able to do this, but they came from development bank, so they're part of that ecosystem, and that is, I think, but that's so development bank has to be more under pressure that they do this, no, by the shareholders, by the stakeholders. Yeah, and because I think they have proven over time that they can stimulate small business to become bigger business, and to become successful, no, and then get them access to credit. I think even in the case of most of the development bank DFIs, you see when they accept, they enter in a fund or they enter in a company, then also the commercial sector is looking more, because they know that the governance of these companies is okay, that the ESG screening is good. They know that the development bank sees that these are profitable businesses, and then they start looking at it. So it's the fact that development banks take part in business already helps a lot to create the attention of others. And still, I think in governments, if you look at the policy side, there is awareness of that the private sector is important, much more awareness than in the past. But still, government prefer to work with other governments, no, and still are very suspicious of the private sector and not very knowledgeable in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
So it's difficult for them to understand. So using the development bank, but also create knowledge within the governments. I think what I see, at least in Europe, could help a lot, and really, let's say, push the envelope for more for the private sector. And the governments are very risk averse. That's another problem, no? So when something goes wrong in the projects, and there are questions in Parliament, then the government wants to stop everything and doesn't see that this is part of life. Things go well, things go wrong. Not every project in governments, the project government themselves execute. The big portion is failing, and is not a success. But if there's something in the private sector that's not a success, then suddenly it's a big problem. So if you want, let's say, also to do more in fragile states, and you don't want any failures, that's a contradiction that doesn't work. So you have to accept failures, and you have to learn from them. I think that is the important part. If you are too risk aware, also on the reputational risk, which in these times is very difficult, because one error and it's all over the place, and your reputation
Nanno, what you're suggesting really is fundamental change, right? What you're saying is that if I can carry it forward, not your words, but what you're saying is that development banks become the agent for private banks, private companies to invest in development, where the credibility and the experience of the development bank can be transferred, right? Ultimately, this ILX thing is about that, right? So they have become an intermediary for the private sector institutional investors. And I think the challenge you mentioned is, I'm repeating it, so you can correct me, is that there is not enough assets to package them and to sell them to the private sector as well. And the continued suspicion of the private sector leads to that, and some risk awareness on part of the politicians who are ultimately making the decisions, because they look good when things go good. If they don't, then their politics is affected. I think this is really an interesting conversation, Nanno. Thank you for sort of taking part in this. And I think we need to sort of think about, we don't let this ILX transaction be a one-off, but how do you create that with IFC, and how do you create that with others that they're quite capable of doing it?
IFC is participating now, so all the development banks are open to share their syndicated loans with ILX, also because the market is changing, so there are not many other players in it. So all the development banks are there, but we need to scale it up. And therefore, as you say, it's important that those assets are created. No?
Yeah. Great. Now that's really, it's all of it. Steve Jobs said all these rules, all these things that we make are made by us to be broken, to be changed. So the idea of perception of risk, taking some defined capital and moving towards that, which you're seeing, like kinetics, and some of these efforts are there that are coming out. They're too small and too limited. And what I'm finding is that as the development impact investing field is increasing, the capacity of institution like FMO are constrained because they have so many people, and and the industry is growing. So increased resources for the development bank, and recognizing, there's a lot of value that development bank have added in people complain or whether they're slow and this and that, but really you have to, if you look objectively, the progress that development banks have made and will continue to play a role as this intermediate agent, or as doing the things that where the private sector can't completely come in and sort of take away some of those elements, and shifting the focus towards a combination of a public-private partnership, if you may think about it in some ways, can really catapult the industry. I think they're really such important issues, and I'm glad that we talked about all the difficult issues: first loss capital, capacity, the ability to engage private sector. The private sectors continue to see all the the cases against Deutsche Bank and against BlackRock around paying lip service to ESG and really doing anything. And I've sensed a lot of private sectors they're rebranding themselves into impact. Those are challenges that as an industry we will have to face. It's not a dictatorship that we can handle that, right? It's a matter of us progressing. But I think communication would play out. How important do you think is the element of communication? Is it partly because people don't know that this thing exists, or the right people don't know at the private sector bank about ILX, or they're just not ready? They don't have that pigeonhole. Like you said, if you have a person who supports it, like Fred Otterson, who did it at Storebrand, and then he leaves, don't have any pigeonhole to put this thing in. And so they have to create a pigeonhole for these social investments.
No, absolutely. I think it's key. But let's say development banks are not very keen on a lot of, let's say, it doesn't have their model to have, to publicate a lot. Of course, they publicate on their successes, but communication and big crowds, they get the money from the capital markets and from the governments. So there's no need for that. And in the countries where they operate, they find their clients. So there's no need of a lot of communication or propaganda. It's especially, I think, important in to understand the model. That was part of the idea of writing my small book, to make the model understandable, and what difference can it make for let's say people who are not involved in the DFI sector. Yeah, so it's and I think it's the awareness of leaders, of the big principles of development finance, to apply them in their businesses, to apply them in government, and to apply them in capital markets.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that, and I really think this book is sort of talks about fundamental issues of setting very high standards. Although feels like and that's some of the quotes in your book about people talking about how they felt they would never be able to meet the standards, although they knew that they were it was good for them, and that sort of bringing it together and explaining. I see a role for a documentary or a half an hour sales pitch to the CEOs that can come from development bank CEOs, that we are doing this, you can be a part of it, and you can help us get there. So I think it's, like you said, the right people, the right communication to further these goals and to further their engagement. Or like for example, the structures we work with at Nanno, this the CDO, we have financings with 50% first loss protection, where the private sector would never see a loss, but they still are reluctant to invest in that. And that, I think, is a perceptual issue. And the willingness to do it has to come first. And that's why individuals become so important, as one person would take an interest, but how do you institutionalize those roles?
Yeah, no, I agree. What you're saying is, what you see in the institutional investors and a lot of commercial investors, they really are not able or are not willing or don't have the capacity to understand the risks involved. So they say easily it's complicated, it's too small, so it's not for me. While with a little bit of more effort, and of course that takes a cost. And that's in a lot of cases a hurdle. They just say no, blended. And I think the pension funds in the Netherlands said we're not going to invest in blended finance. It's too complicated. It's not straightforward. So it's not part of the kind of investment we do. I think that's very structural problem. No, so if you come as, it always is a little bit more complicated than a straightforward government.
Sure.
And there are only a very few investors that are willing to take the effort to understand it and to make the assessment and then to make the investment.
Right. I mean, I think that's really very insightful. I really do see some role for us to continue to work towards some sort of communication with the corporate world,
of course,
like we've talked about, because I think that.
No, I think it's very helpful if you could do that.
So some sort of short video documentary that talks about, I think that could serve us well in terms of, at this time where there's a lot of complaint about greenwashing. I really do see this, that there's some value there. It's coming to a close, but I think lastly, I have two questions that I would ask you is, how do you see the role of, we talked about the development banks and we talked about the private sector, but we haven't talked about another important ingredient, which is foundations. And how do you see that role coming into place? And lastly, how do you see the future? I mean, what do you think is going to happen in your mind's eye a decade from now? How do you see progression? Because you have seen decades of work at FMO, seen decades of progress towards more blending private sector. So maybe those two questions you can cover as one last question from me, Nanno. What do you think? Ideally, in your ideal state of mind?
Yeah. Well, thinking about the future is not easy. No, but let's say what I see is that, and I'm sure the development banks, they are now, when I started, it was a small sector. Now I think it's within 100 and 200 billion. of assets that are created by the development bank. So I think that trend will continue, and I hope it accelerates. At the same time, we see problems in societies increasing. Inequality is increasing because of COVID now, because of the high inflation, of a setback in a lot of countries where the device works. So I think it is clear that focused investments that include people in the labor process, in development, is absolutely clear and absolutely necessary. Well, the same as with the green economy and climate, I think we are feeling it. This is the last day of October. It was 23 degrees in the Netherlands, the warmest day ever. So on one hand we enjoy it, but on the other hand we all feel it's very scary that that this is happening. So we need to act, and I think also their development finance institutions will be helpful. Yeah, unfortunately, let's say, looking at the future at this moment in time, you see more problems than solutions. But I think often the problems lead to see the necessity for change, and I'm sure that if you see what the development banks have done in the past, they can even play a much bigger role in the future in helping these problems to solve these kind of problems.
I appreciate what you said, that the problems itself lend to a solution, and that saying so. One one of the at the GIN conference this year, I don't know if you heard the guy who went into the Arctic. He's an American guy who went to the Arctic, and what he said is that I was seeing the climate change a while back, when I was going to this. We are all witnessing climate change now, and hopefully the will to change and to drive the necessary elements towards that is very real. So I appreciate your thoughts about the problem, the challenge itself. Crisis creates an opportunity, and opportunity is now. And I think appreciate your very insightful, really frank conversation that you've had today. So I thank you. And I see some more effort from your part there in sort of trying to bring the. I think that's really something that we should talk about. But thank you so much, Nanno. Any parting
Thank you.
words,
it was a pleasure, Asad.
Yeah, that you want to give the young folks that are struggling and not finding the investors and challenged by all these opportunities? Any word from your life experience that may help the young impact investors get over the challenges and to not give up the hope?
Well, I think patience is an important one.
Yeah.
No, you see, I think you see change and you see things happening, but it all goes slower. So that's my experience over all the years. Things happen, but they go slower than you would like to. So you need patience, but the change will be there. Yeah, and so patience and perseverance are very important.
Yes, and some catalyst that can spark a little bit faster. We do need a little bit faster.
No, and people. So everybody, the persons makes the difference. So I think also the young people see that they can make the difference. Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you, Nanno. It was always a pleasure to talk to you. Yeah, I think we should give more opportunity for you to share your wisdom and your experience, and look forward to continuing to have those conversations with you, Nanno. Thank you so much today. And,
thank you, Asad.
Thank you very much.